Okay, thank you, Charles, for the kind introduction and for chairing this session. So indeed, I will talk about how we can use biochar in horticulture and mainly in growing media. So, but I work at the ILVO, so I will first introduce ILVO. It's the Flanders Research Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. And we have a quite complex structure. As you can see, we have 4 units. But around these units, we have several thematic topics where we do research on. And then we also have living labs to collaborate with other stakeholders on these topics. And we, of course, also have a research infrastructure to deal with all these questions. Today, the results I will present, they are from the BASTA project. And the BASTA project, it's on the added value of biochar for sustainable land use. And in this project, we have really targeted applications. So we want to use biochar in processes, in growing media, or in horticultural substrates, as we tell it. And then also we want to use the biochar in open field cultivation to solve problems with drought or with soil pollution. So for covering all these questions, we have 5 work packages in the project. So the first one is, of course, the production of biochar, in which we always have a feedback loop with the other applications to see how we can improve or we can optimize the biochar production. In the second work package, we look at the use of biochar in biomass processing or in manure storage and processing to reduce the emissions from ammonia and greenhouse gases, but also to improve the processes. This was the topic of the previous webinar by my colleague Jarinda Viana. So you can see that there is a paper published and also that the recording is still on YouTube. Then the topic of today is the use of biochar in growing media. In the project, we look on the use of biochar to replace chemical crop protection products and also to increase the disease suppression of growing media. But we also look at peat replacement and the reduction of nutrient losses. So that's the topic of today. And then later on in work package 4, we further work on the use of biochar in these open field applications. And then in the last work package, all aspects on economics, but also on sustainability, on ecosystem services, and also the legal bottlenecks or the legal criteria that we should have to use biochar in these different applications are focused on. So why growing media? Well, here you see pictures of different crops and different cultivation systems where we don't grow plants anymore in the soil, but we use a growing medium to grow these crops. And it's sometimes related to problems with the soil that crops can't grow anymore in soil due to pollution or due to other factors, or that the disease suppression in the soil is too high to have a good cultivation. Or it can be that we need a higher productivity than we can have in the soil. So in that case, we also go to greenhouses and we use growing media. And also with the growing population and parts of the world, we have bigger and bigger cities. And to provide fresh food close to these big cities, we also need these high high intensity cultivation systems to produce these fresh crops. And for that, we also need greenhouses and we also need this growing media. And on the bottom right, you also see some blocks we use to grow seedlings into small crops and blocks of growing media. And these blocks we then transplant into the soil. And that's also a way to improve the crop development in the beginning or to overcome problems with soils like drought or other problems in the beginning of the crop cultivation. In most of this growing media, peat is a very important constituent, but peat is a little bit under discussion because when we excavate peat from wetlands, we destroy these wetlands, and actually we need these wetlands to store a lot of carbon and also to store a lot of water. So more and more countries in Europe want to reduce the peat use in horticulture to preserve these wetland ecosystems. So now we are looking for alternatives to peat. And in this table, you see actually the conventional materials which are used. So we have peat, but we also have a lot of core products which are transported over a long distance. And they need a lot of processing, like washing and buffering before they can be used in growing media. There are also mineral wool products which can be used, but they need a lot of fossil fuels to be produced. So it's a very energy intensive production. Also, materials which are heated like perlite, they need a lot of energy for production. Then there are several alternatives which are already used in growing media. We think about different types of composts, or maybe wood fiber, rice hulls, and also peat moss. So in contrast to peat moss, it's really the fresh grown layer on top of a peatland, and that can be harvested in a very sustainable way. So that can be used without any problems. But we are also working on other alternatives which are currently tested, like woody composts or plant fibers, but of course also biochar. That's the topic of the presentation of today. And another strategy to replace peat is to reuse growing media for more than one cultivation cycle. So it can be a direct reuse, or we can convert it after composting or biochar production. So when we talk about controlled environmental horticulture, so it means that you grow crops in a controlled environment like a greenhouse. There are some topics about sustainability of these systems. For instance, when we talk about growing media, we need to take into account the end-of-life impact because it's really important for the sustainability. And also we want to move from a system from linear use of growing media to circular use. So by more reuse, recycling, or by using them as a soil amendment after use in greenhouses. We also want to use renewable biomass in a cascading system. So maybe we can first use it in growing media for greenhouse cultivation, and afterwards we can use it as a soil improver to store carbon in arable lands. Of course, we also need to move from the current chemical fertilizers to renewable fertilizers with a lower environmental impact. And in the discussion, of course, we also need to figure out what is the role of biochar in growing media. So does it have an added value for the crop? Does it have an added value for carbon sequestration? And can we use this biochar also in a cascading system? So these are the topics of the presentation of today. Well, biochar in growing media, it can really have several functions. Well, you can use biochar for increasing the disease suppression of a growing medium. You can use biochar as a carrier for biocontrol organisms, or maybe for nutrients. It can be a liming agent, it can be a fertilizer, it can be a bulking material in horticultural substrates, or you can just use 100% of biochar as a horticultural substrate. And biochar is also a recycling strategy for growing media. They are sorted here from, on top you have the smallest doses which are used. It's sometimes only 1 gram per liter of material that you use of the biochar, while the lower ones, they are really like full biochar, so 100% biochar. The production of biochar can also be part of a cultivation system. So pyrolysis, it can result in heating, and the heat you can use for the greenhouse, and the CO2 you can also recover and use it as a CO2 fertilizer, while the biochar you can use in the growing media. So we start with using biochar in very low doses, so like a spice actually. And I have here 3 examples of things we use as spices in growing media. So on the left you have the biochar, in the middle you have the chitin, and on the right you have the elemental sulfur. We use them in doses of 1 or 2 gram per liter of substrate. But the difference between biochar and the other two is that biochar is actually working in a chemical way, but its effects, it's really microbiological. So you can see changes in the microbiology and the rhizosphere of the growing medium, while for the chitin and the elemental sulfur, they work in a microbial way and they have a chemical effect. For instance, chitin, it results also in nitrogen release, so mineral nitrogen in the root zone, while the elemental sulfur, it results in a pH decrease of the growing medium. So in contrast to using biochar as a spice, you can also use it like 100% standalone horticultural substrate. It seems very promising when you think in terms of reuse of the substrate, because after one cultivation, we expect that the biochar will still be quite as it was in the beginning. There will now be physical deterioration of your material. However, there is one big problem with biochar. All biochars have a high pH and maybe a too high pH to grow plants directly in the biochar. So maybe we should select specific biochars for the standalone horticultural substrates. So maybe biochars made from woody feedstocks with low nutrient contents. They should have a low buffering capacity. So it means that if you put them in an acid, in contact with an acid, that they take over this acidic pH. And they should also have a low inorganic carbon content, so a low carbon calcium carbonate content, because that also indicates that you have a low buffering capacity of this biochar. So one option that we have tried in this project was to acidify the biochars with elemental sulfur. Elemental sulfur, it's actually, when you put it in an aerobic environment with organic matter, you get a microbial conversion from the elemental sulfur to sulfates, and it results in a decrease of the pH of the material. And we have been successful in testing it for compost with a low buffer capacity, and also for plant fibers to reduce the pH in a very short term. So within 2 to 4 weeks, with a very small dose. So between 0.5 and 2 grams sulfur per liter was sufficient to decrease the pH of these materials and to make them suitable to be used as a growing medium. So we also wanted to try it with biochars. And the good news is that it can work, but the bad news is that you need a lot of time to do that. So here you see in the table the results for 3 biochars, an oak, pine, and a willow biochar with initial pHs about 7.5. And you see that for 2 of the 3 biochars, we were able to reduce the pH below 6. These 2 biochars, they had a low inorganic carbon content, while the one with a higher inorganic carbon content, we could not really reduce the pH that strongly. Well, and if we then compare it, for instance, with the buffer capacity, we also see that the biochar with the highest buffer capacity didn't really had a decreased pH. And another test that we did with these biochars is to mix them with peat. So a very acidic peat, non-lined peat. And you see that 2 of the 3 biochars, they took over the pH of the acidic peat, while the oak biochar, it was still able to increase the pH of the peat mix. So it can work to acidify the biochars, but it can, it takes a lot of time, and we are now testing to speed up the process. And one thing that really worked very well was to provide sufficient water, because in this process, water is needed. We also added some additives one by one, and it didn't really work that very well. But one combination of additives was, quite promising in the first test. So we are further testing this, and we will come back with results on this next year. So when we think about using biochar as a standalone substrate or as a bulk agent together with other materials and growing media, it should be like structured materials. Like here you have flax chives. It's a side product of flax, growing flax and extracting the fibers for textiles. And the promising thing when you convert it into biochar is that you have a reduction in and the mass, but you remain or you keep the same volume of material. And for growing media, the volume, it's really very important because you grow plants and, for instance, 1 liter of substrate. And here you'll see what happens with, for instance, flax or miscanthus when you convert them into biochar. So very striking is that you get a clear increase of the carbon content, and as a consequence, because your organic matter content is decreasing, very limited, but there is a small decrease. You see that the organic matter to carbon ratio of your biochar, it's completely different than from your initial feedstock. So that's why we advise always to express biomass on a carbon basis and not on an organic matter basis to avoid any problems with that. So we see like an up concentration of carbon in the biochar. And then when we look to the nutrients and the pH and the EC, we see that pH is increasing. The EC, well, there's no real trend that we can see. But of course, because of the up concentration of the nutrients during biochar production, we also see that, for instance, phosphorus, potassium, they are increasing in concentration. So that's the story of using biochar as a standalone substrate. However, when we want to mix it with other components in a growing medium, there might be other aspects that we need to take into account. So for looking at that, we did 6 full-scale trials at Proefcentrum Hoogstraten. It's near Antwerpen. We had 3 trials with tomato and 3 with strawberry. And these 4 trials were really taking like 10 months, so they were very extended cultivation systems. And 2 trials were shorter cultivations of strawberry or tomato. And in these trials, we compared peat-based blends or mineral wool as the reference substrate with a peat-reduced blend for strawberry and a completely peat-free blend for tomato. So for tomato, we went from mineral wool to a complete organic mixture, which was also peat-free. And in this trial, we could compare also 3 blends where we had 10 volume% of woody biochar added with the same blend without this biochar. So it was for 3 trials, so 1 peat-free blend and 2 peat-reduced blends with this biochar addition or not. And the good news is that in any of the trials, we didn't see any yield decrease when we moved from the peat blend or the mineral wool to a peat-reduced or a peat-free blend. And in some cases, we even had a higher yield when we used the new blends. So that's really promising. So you see here a picture of the blends. So for instance, when you start on the left, on the right, sorry, you have the mineral wool slabs, which are used normally for tomato, and we compared it with a completely organic mixture. And then you see the strawberry blend, which is normally made up of peat, cocoa, and perlite. And 40% of this blend was replaced by green compost or wood fiber. So 2 important things to look at is actually the carbon stability and the carbon over phosphorus ratio. And for the mineral wool slabs, we saw actually that they had a very low carbon stability. That's because the only carbon which was available was the roots which were formed in the mineral slabs. On the other hand, the carbon to phosphorus ratio, it was also very low for these materials. And then you see that for the other materials, it was better with actually the best results for the biochar. So it's very stable carbon, and it also has a very high carbon to phosphorus ratio. These results are also presented here in a table. So when we compare peat with rock wool, we see, of course, that peat is very rich in carbon, and it has a high carbon stability in contrast to the rock wool. We also see a little bit confusing that rock wool is very rich in nutrients. It's because it's made of rocks, which contain a lot of minerals initially already. And then when we look at the carbon to nitrogen or carbon to phosphorus ratio, we also see that peat is much better for this characteristic and compared to the rock wool. And then when we compare it to the peat reduced or the peat free blends, we see that in most cases they perform quite similar as the peat. So there is no really risk of, when moving from peat to peat reduced or peat free blends, to reduce the value of the spent growing media as a soil improver. So that's really good news. So we can really move from peat to less peat without having problems with the second life of the growing medium. So you want, of course, to know what is the effect of adding 10 volume% of biochar to the blend. Well, for a lot of characteristics, we didn't see any big effect, no significant effect. However, we saw that when we added the biochar, we saw that the organic carbon content increased by almost 10%. We saw also that the CN ratio was decreasing. And we also saw that the CEC was decreasing when it was expressed on a carbon basis, but when we expressed it on the dry matter basis of the material, we didn't see any significant change. But it's very important here to see that biochar can really increase the carbon content of the material after the first use. And then the question was what happens with the biochar, and for answering that question, we could retrieve the biochars from 3 blends by picking them out and analyzing them. And then we saw that for several characteristics, there was no change in characteristics, while we saw that the pH of the biochar was really decreasing during the use as growing medium. So it was like 3 pH units, which is quite huge. We saw also that more nitrate was available or was present in the biochar, and also the total nitrogen content was higher after using growing medium, which resulted in a decrease of the CN ratio of the biochar. And also unexpected was that we saw that the CEC of the biochar increased during use of the biochar in the growing medium. So moving from peat to peat-free or peat-reduced, blends shouldn't give any big problems in terms of carbon stability, also CN and CP ratio. And we also saw a low nitrogen mineralization rate of all blends. So that's very promising to use these materials as a soil improver. Well, the biochar characteristics are affected by their stay in the growing medium. So you see a decrease in pH and an increase in nitrogen loading. And we see that when you add biochar in the blend, the spent growing medium has a higher carbon content, which is promising, but we didn't see any signs of a higher carbon stability. And to give more information on the effects of using materials in the growing medium, you see here box plots presenting different materials. So the first 5 box plots are virgin materials that we use in growing media. And you see that peat is the very stable material because it has a low CO2 flux measured, while other materials like straw fibers, they have a very high instability, so they have a high CO2 release. But the very nice thing that we see here is that for the spent growing media, so at the end of cultivation, we see that we measure very low low CO2 emissions. So these materials are very stable. So it means actually that when you use materials as a growing medium, they get more stable during this use as a horticultural substrate. So it's actually like processing material into a better quality material. So up till now, we mainly focused on using biochar as for replacing peat or other materials. But you can also use biochar for reusing growing media at the end of cultivation. So that's the second part of the presentation. Because in greenhouses, these systems, they allow to use water and nutrients in a very efficient way. And in most systems, it's a closed system, so no water or nutrients are lost. But at the end, of course, you remove the plants and you remove the spent growing media from the greenhouse, and they may contain still a lot of carbon or still a lot of nutrients. And well, one question we had was when we would directly reuse the growing media for another cultivation, or we convert them into biochar, or we convert them into compost, whether these three materials still have potential to be used as again as a growing medium. And to answer this question, we made a score based on 8 characteristics of the materials, and we scored them between 0 and 2. It means that in the end you get a sum between 0 or 1 and 16, indicating the higher scores, indicating a higher potential for reusing these materials. And we did it for several peat-based materials, pure or converted into biochar or compost. And one thing that we saw, of course, that when you convert them into biochar or compost, that you see that the nutrient content is increasing by at least a factor 2. So that's something to take into account. On the other hand, we saw that the score of the 3 materials were quite comparable. So it means if you have a direct reuse of the material or you convert them into biochar or compost, they still have a good score or a good potential to be reused as a growing medium. So that's really very promising for circular horticulture. To give you some indication of what happens when you convert a spent growing medium into biochar. So we have done this for 4 samples. And you see again that the carbon content is strongly increasing when you convert it into biochar. We see also that pH is increasing. And we also see that the nutrient content, for instance, phosphorus and potassium, it's strongly increasing. So the material is stable, but it's also very rich in nutrients. But these nutrients, they are, of course, accumulated during the first cultivation. And another question that we asked ourselves was, can we reduce this nutrient accumulation by, for instance, reducing the nutrient levels and the fertigation, so the combination of water and nutrients? And we did it in strawberry trials, and you see here box plots with 4 types. So the red one, it's regular peat-based growing media from different growers that we have collected. The orange ones, they are partly peat reduced already, also from different growers or trials. And then you have the yellow box. It's are the trials that we did with peat-based blends with a reduced fertigation. And then we also have the gray box. It's the peat-reduced blends, also with a reduced fertigation. And when you look at nitrogen or magnesium or calcium, you don't see any big differences due to the reduced fertigation. So it did not really have an effect on nutrient accumulation in that case. However, for potassium and also for phosphorus, we were very successful in reducing the accumulation of these elements. So it means by reducing fertigation, you can reduce accumulation, and you can also reduce the total nutrient content in the compost or the biochar that you make from these materials. So to come to a conclusion, when we talk about growing media, and we compare biochar with the conventional materials, we see that biochar really has good effects on the end of life impact of materials, and it also has promising aspects in terms of circular use of materials and nutrients. When we talk about using renewable biomass in cascade, we also see that biochar is promising because you can also first use it in a greenhouse as a growing medium, and then you can use it as a soil improver for carbon sequestration. Besides that, we also saw that the phosphorus and potassium in the biochar, it's really plant available, so it's really also a fertilizer. And then in the end, we also saw that the biochar can help us for carbon sequestration and soil, so that's also very promising. But I think we still need to work on the whole cascade concept of biochar. So that's work in progress, actually. And why is, well, we did 2 full-scale trials with strawberry in 2021 and 2022, where we compared 4 blends. So a peat-reduced blend with only 50% peat and a complete peat-free blend. And the same blend was added with 10 volume% of biochar. And these 4 blends of these 2 trials, we are now checking the potential for direct reuse. But we converted these materials also into biochar, so we can compare it with direct reuse. And we also did small-scale composting trials with these materials, so we will be able to compare these 3 strategies for reuse of growing media. And in the end, maybe we will come to a system that we produce biochar that will end up somewhere in the soil at some time, but in between, we will be able to use the biochar first as a growing medium and then use the growing medium with the biochar for soil improvement. And maybe we can also first use the biochar for biomass processing and reduce emissions of ammonia and greenhouse gases, and then convert this compost or whatever into growing media, and so on and so on. If you need more information on all these aspects, we also had 5 webinars, and 3 of them were on really focusing on biochar. If you need more information, you can find it also in this table. And with this slide, I would really like to thank you for your kind attention.